Episode 1: The House by the Silent Lake. This is Maine. Not the postcard Maine you see with the quaint lighthouses. This is the Maine where the fog rolls in like morning shroud silk, where winter is an almost eternal thing, and silence is a heavy presence that can suffocate your mind. The house we speak of is here, deep within the Blackwood Forest, facing Mirror Lake. They call it Mirror Lake because the water is always unnaturally still, reflecting everything perfectly. Too perfectly, perhaps. Liam and Clara, a young couple, moved in during late September. Liam, a writer, was seeking isolation to finish his book. Clara, an art teacher, was looking for space to breathe. They bought the old house for an unbelievably low price. The realtor only offered a nervous smile and said, "It's just old and a little remote." The 3-story wooden house, over 100 years old, sat right on the water's edge. The moment Clara stepped inside, she felt a profound chill. Not the chill of autumn, but a cold that sank into the bone, as if the house had never truly been warm in a century. Liam, however, found it inspiring. "Listen, honey," he told Clara, standing by the window overlooking the lake. "This silence, it's perfect. Nothing. Absolutely nothing." And that was the first and most terrifying truth. Mirror Lake was utterly silent. No insect chirps, no birdsong, not even the croaking of frogs. It was as if every living thing had been warned, and they chose to keep their distance. The first night was uneasy. Liam woke up to a sound, not a loud sound, but a steady, monotonous clacking, like something heavy and metallic being dragged across the wooden floor. The sound was coming from the attic. "Just a stray cat," he muttered, trying to reassure Clara and himself. But the next day, when he went up to check the attic, Liam found nothing but a single loose floorboard. Beneath the board, he discovered a tattered, leather-bound diary. It belonged to a girl named Sarah, who had lived in the house in the 1950s. Initially, the diary was filled with the innocent scribbles of a child. But then, the content darkened rapidly. March 17th. "Daddy doesn't talk anymore. Mommy is always looking at the lake. I hear the clacking in the attic. It's looking for something." March 25th. Sarah drew a picture. It was a distorted, childish drawing of a tall, thin, faceless entity standing at the water's edge. Underneath, she wrote, "It wants quiet. It likes the dark." Ever since Liam found the diary, the atmosphere in the house shifted. Clara began working in the living room. Every time she turned her back to her easel, she swore the paint jars had been subtly moved. She saw thin scratches on the window frame, like fingernail marks. Liam, meanwhile, couldn't write a single sentence. He just sat and reread the diary. He started seeing things that Clara didn't. He saw the shadow of Sarah, the girl from the diary, standing at the end of the hall, always with her back to him. One night around 3 a.m., they both woke up. This time it wasn't the clacking, but the sound of water lapping against the shore. They lived only a few yards from the lake, but the sound was not like a natural wave. It was a slow, heavy sound, as if something enormous was dragging itself onto the bank out of the thick mud. Liam slowly opened the window. A thick fog blanketed the lake. He couldn't see anything. "Do you hear that, Liam?" Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Don't turn on the light," he gestured. The lapping stopped. In its place was a very faint whispering, right outside their bedroom window. It wasn't language, but a combination of a wheezing breath and a low moan, as if someone was trying to speak after nearly drowning. Liam finally turned on the bedside lamp. The weak yellow light swept across the room. Nothing. Nothing but a sticky, black smear of mud on the outer windowsill. The next morning, Clara went to wash her face. When she looked in the mirror, she screamed. Not because of a ghost, but because her face in the bathroom mirror was slightly faded, like an old, overexposed photograph, while Liam's reflection remained perfectly clear. Liam tried to reassure her. It must be steam or an old mirror. But then he went to look at their shared photographs taken in the house. In all of them, Clara's face was subtly obscured, hidden by a shadow, blurred by a sudden flash of light, or just faintly faded, as if she were slowly being erased from the picture. That night, Liam was rereading Sarah's diary. He got to the final entry, scrawled messily in what looked like blood or a dark, viscous liquid. It comes from the water. It wants quiet. It says one person must go so the space is quiet enough for it to sleep. Daddy, Mommy, and then me. And it has chosen the next face. Liam looked up. Clara was standing at the edge of the bed. She wasn't crying anymore. Her face was utterly blank, pale, and devoid of emotion. Liam. Her voice was cold and flat. I'm tired of being seen. He saw the darkness in her eyes. The light was gone. And then he saw it. In the corner of the room, reflected in the shadows, was the tall, thin, faceless entity standing directly behind Clara. Liam's eyes were locked on the darkness. He realized the horrifying truth. Mirror Lake wasn't a mirror. It was the eye of something vast, sleeping beneath. And it had just woken up, bringing with it the ultimate silence of death. The entity raised a long, thin, skeletal arm, not to harm Liam, but to gently place it on Clara's shoulder. Clara turned, looking at Liam with a hideous smile. Not hers, but the smile of the silence. And then the clacking started again, not in the attic, but the sound of long metallic fingers gently tapping against the bedroom window. Liam screamed, but no sound escaped. The entire house, the room, and finally himself were sinking into the absolute quiet of Mirror Lake. Episode 2, The Phantom Lights of Route 66. If you've ever driven through the arid deserts of Arizona, you know that Route 66 is more than just a road. It's an old American artery, saturated with stories and ghosts. But there is one particular stretch where the miles never seem to end, an abandoned, unmarked segment where the cracked asphalt is nothing more than a gray scar in the red sand. This story is about 4 friends: Marcus, the eternal skeptic; Chloe, the documentarian; Ben, the paranormal tracker; and Sarah, the only one who felt true fear from the start. They were on a journey to film a short movie about a local legend, the Phantom Headlights. The legend claims that in 1978, a semi-truck carrying illegal cargo, not drugs or weapons, but cursed artifacts from an old New Mexico church, crashed violently here. The driver, a man named Jedediah, was burned alive. Since then, on new moon nights, the headlights of that truck appear, chasing other cars down the desolate road. They arrived at the lonely stretch around dusk. Chloe set up the cameras. Marcus scoffed. A total fabrication. It's just light refracting off some distant hill, he claimed. But when the sun fully set and inky black night descended, their car headlights were nearly useless against the endless darkness of the desert. Ben turned on his electromagnetic field, EMF reader. The needle instantly began to jump erratically. Around 11 p.m., it appeared. In the far distance behind them, a pair of dull, yellowish lights abruptly flickered on. "That's it," Ben whispered, his voice a mix of excitement and terror. Marcus slammed the accelerator, trying to speed up, but the truck seemed to be gaining on them effortlessly, even though the distance remained significant. Chloe, filming through the rear window, suddenly noticed something strange. The lights weren't moving according to the laws of physics. They weren't bobbing up and down like a vehicle on a rough road. They glided perfectly smooth. The more they were pursued, the harder Marcus pressed the gas. Their speed hit 80, 90, then 100 miles per hour, yet the headlights behind them did not fade. On the contrary, they grew brighter, closer. "It's gaining," Sarah screamed. "Faster, Marcus." Suddenly, the ghostly truck vanished. The four of them breathed a collective sigh of relief. Marcus nervously chuckled. "See? Someone just took a turn." But Chloe pointed frantically at the windshield. "No, look!" Right in front of them, only a few hundred yards away, that same pair of dull yellow headlights had reappeared, standing motionless in the middle of the road. It had overtaken them without passing them. Marcus slammed the brakes so hard the car nearly flipped. The phantom truck became clearer. An old rusted semi, its cargo bed filled with obscure wooden crates. Inside the cabin, they saw the driver's silhouette, Jedediah. His face was horribly disfigured, like a mass of scorched flesh. But the most terrifying thing wasn't his face. It was his eyes. Jedediah's eyes glowed like embers, and the truck's headlights didn't seem to be bulbs, but the blazing reflection of the pure wrath in his gaze. "Back up!" Marcus reversed the car. As they backed away, the truck in front of them also slowly reversed, maintaining a fixed distance. They were trapped. Ben tried his phone. No signal. Absolutely nothing. Sarah began to sob uncontrollably. "I read about it." "He's cursed. Those artifacts. They locked him to this road. He doesn't want to hurt us. He just wants us to carry him away." Suddenly, a sound began emanating from the cargo bed of the truck ahead, a groaning of wood, like something was breaking out of the crates. Then, the phantom truck's headlights went out, completely. They were plunged into darkness. "What's happening?" Chloe asked, trembling. "Did it run out of gas?" "Battery?" Marcus stammered, but no. A new sound began, right behind them, from inside their own car. A faint pair of dull yellow lights suddenly flickered on inside the vehicle. The light didn't come from the dashboard. It was coming from the trunk area, where Chloe stored equipment. When they turned around, they saw an old wooden crate, identical to those on the truck, had appeared in the back seat. The crate split open, and a pair of smoldering yellow lights shone out from within. They hadn't been chased by the truck. The cursed artifacts were trying to transfer into their car. At that very moment, their car engine roared to life. The accelerator automatically slammed, sending the car hurtling forward. "No! Someone drive!" Marcus wrestled with the steering wheel, but it was useless. In the rearview mirror, they saw Jedediah, the ghost driver, standing where his truck had just disappeared. He was no longer angry. He was smiling. The friend's car sped wildly down Route 66, now cursed itself, carrying the burden of ancient evil. As they passed the mile markers, they realized they were driving on a segment of road they had already passed. Everything was repeating. They had become the new phantoms of Route 66, locked in an endless loop of terrifying night drives, carrying the cursed cargo. And behind them, Jedediah's old truck had vanished, replaced by their own car. Do you see any headlights on the highway? Never assume they are chasing you. Perhaps they are only trying to find someone else to carry them. Episode 3, The Mine That Ate Souls. This is Silver Creek, a crumbling ghost town nestled in the Rocky Mountains of Colorado. Silver Creek was the height of the 19th century gold rush, a place built on greed. But the miners dug too deep. They didn't just take metal. They disturbed something that had slept for millennia beneath the mountain. Our subject is Dr. Elias Thorne, a geologist hired by a mining corporation. His mission? To assess the stability of the Blackheart mine, which had been sealed for almost 70 years after a horrific cave-in known locally as the Breath Disaster. Before he entered, a nearby indigenous elder tried to warn Elias. "Don't dig too deep, son. This mountain has lungs, and its breath is the breath of stolen souls. They don't want gold. They want warmth." Elias, the rational man, dismissed the warning. He entered Blackheart, carrying only a headlamp, a seismograph, and the confidence of a scientist. The moment he passed the rotten wooden seal, he felt a sudden drop in temperature. It wasn't the natural cold of the earth. It was a draining cold, as if heat was being actively pulled from his body. The mine was a dark maze of cramped tunnels, shored up by rickety wooden supports. As he went deeper, Elias's seismic equipment began recording unusual sonic vibrations. Not earthquakes or rock slides. These were whispers. Hundreds of faint, mingled voices echoing from the stone walls. Elias stopped. He turned on his audio recorder. What it captured made his hair stand on end. It was the sound of cries for help, coughing fits, and desperate prayers in various languages: English, Spanish, even Mandarin. All the voices of the miners who had died in the collapse. "You're just residual sound signatures," he told himself, trying to stay calm. But then, one of the voices spoke clearly, right behind him. It was a man's raspy moan. Cold. So cold. Elias whirled around. No one. He hurried on. He ran down a small side tunnel where he planned to place his monitoring equipment. When he stopped, the most terrifying thing happened. His headlamp suddenly died. Completely. The darkness wasn't the scary part. The truly terrifying part was the silence that followed. The whispers had stopped. In the absolute blackness, Elias felt a soft burst of warmth lightly graze the back of his neck. Then, a stinging sensation, as if someone was lightly scratching the skin on his nape. He flipped on his backup light. The weak beam of the small flashlight illuminated the spot where he'd felt the touch. He saw thin, deep scratches on the rock wall, like miners desperately clawing their way out in their final moments. When he tried to find his way back, he realized the wooden support beams had moved. The tunnels were no longer straight. They had shifted, subtly, insidiously, just enough to make every familiar turn a new maze. He frantically searched for the entrance. After about 10 minutes of running in panic, he found the metal sign he had marked, "Exit." But when he looked closer, the sign was bent, and below it, there was a new, crude carving on the rock, written in something dark and viscous. Not warm enough. Elias realized the truth the elder had spoken. The mountain had lungs, and it was a living entity seeking life. Gold had awakened it, but it didn't eat gold. It ate human body heat. He heard the whispers again, but this time they weren't weak cries for help. They were dry, abrasive laughter, like rock grinding against rock. Elias looked up. The tunnel ceiling, solid rock, was now dripping, not water, but a thick black tar-like substance, flowing slowly, coating the walls. He ran at full speed toward where he believed the exit was, but the mine had begun to contract. He saw the huge, rugged stone wall starting to move inward, slowly and irresistibly. This wasn't a cave-in. This was the entity's digestive process. He scrambled through a narrow gap. He looked behind him and saw two massive gritty stone walls, ceiling, crushing the space he had just vacated. In that horrifying moment, Elias clearly saw on one rock face a human face. The face of a miner, pressed tightly against the stone, eyes wide with terror, like a living fossil. He hadn't died from being crushed. He was absorbed into the rock. Elias turned and bolted. He finally found the entrance, the weak sunlight of the morning filtering through. As he crawled out of the mine entrance, gasping for breath, his skin covered in mud and the black liquid, he turned back, looking at the mine door. Right before his eyes, the black-hard entrance, once shored up by wood, slowly closed and merged into the mountainside. Not a collapse, but a seal. The mine had sealed itself, like a maw that had fed enough. Elias looked down at his hands. Both his palms were frostbitten, with dark bruised patches, as if a portion of his life's warmth had been siphoned away. You think the riches found underground are gold? Number. Down there, the true richness is your body heat, and Blackheart only sleeps until it gets cold again. Episode 4. The Curse of the Porcelain Doll. This is the French Quarter, New Orleans, Louisiana, a place where the fog isn't just water vapor, but the breath of trapped spirits, where every antique building holds a tale of voodoo, vengeance, and cursed relics. This story centers on Estelle, the owner of a small antique shop called Echoes of the Past. Estelle was a collector, but instead of seeking out beauty, she was drawn to items imbued with dark, old energy. At a private auction, Estelle acquired a 19th century porcelain doll named Genevieve. The doll was exquisite. Tightly curled blonde hair, a pristine white lace dress, and large, cold, almost living blue eyes, fixed in a perfectly still, unnervingly perfect, subtle smile. The moment Genevieve was placed on the central shelf of the shop, the strange occurrences began. Customers started complaining. They said they heard the soft clacking of tiny footsteps on the wooden floor upstairs, where no one was. They saw other antiques spontaneously fall without wind or contact. One time, a customer swore she saw Genevieve's tiny arm twitch. Estelle initially dismissed it as stress. But one night, she decided to sleep in the shop. Around 2 a.m., she woke up to a familiar sound. Not the clacking, but a faint, weak sobbing, like a deserted child. The weeping came from the glass case where Genevieve was displayed. Estelle approached. She turned on her desk lamp. The doll stood perfectly still, utterly unmoving. But when she looked into those cold blue porcelain eyes, she saw something else. A deep, suppressed rage. It was as if a soul was imprisoned within that cold ceramic shell. The next day, Estelle began researching Genevieve's history. She found faint, old records. The doll belonged to a little girl named Marie, who lived in the 1880s. Marie was brutally murdered, and her spirit refused to pass on. A local voodoo priestess, out of pity, performed a ritual to transfer the child's soul into her most beloved possession, the porcelain doll. However, this trapped soul had festered. It was no longer seeking rest, but vengeance and possession. The more she read, the more Estelle noticed small, inexplicable bruises and scratches appearing on her own body. Specifically, the scratches always appeared on her ankles, as if someone was trying to prevent her from running away. One night, Estelle decided to confront it. She took Genevieve out of the case, and placed her on her work table, facing her. "What do you want?" Estelle asked. There was no sound. But when she looked into the old copper mirror on the wall, she saw Genevieve's reflection change. Its porcelain eyes briefly blinked, and that subtle smile widened into a broad, distorted, hateful grimace. Estelle turned back to the real doll. It remained motionless, still holding the subtle smile. But then she noticed the horrifying detail. She saw the lace on the doll's dress was slightly damp. She reached out and touched it. It wasn't rainwater. It was tears. The salty tears of a trapped child were flowing from its ductless porcelain eye sockets. And then a voice spoke. Not the sobbing, but the clear, chilling voice of an 8-year-old girl, emanating from inside the doll's hollow body. "See? I'm so sad, but I'm so lonely." "You're not alone," Estelle stammered. The voice spoke again, this time carrying a sharp, icy anger. "I need a friend. Forever." The lights in the shop began to flicker violently. The shadowy figures of people who had previously tried to destroy or possess Genevieve began to appear, standing silently in the dark corners, staring at Estelle. They were all adults. Genevieve didn't just want a friend. It wanted a new mother, someone it could love and control eternally, someone who would never abandon her as Marie had been abandoned in death. Estelle's hand suddenly went numb. She looked down. Genevieve's small, cold porcelain hand was clamped tightly around her wrist. The strength was not that of a toy. It was the grip of infinite craving. Estelle tried to pull her hand away but couldn't. She felt a bone-deep coldness migrating from her wrist up her arm. And then the doll began to crawl down the table. Slowly, with the sound of porcelain scraping on wood, it crept toward Estelle. Its blue eyes never left hers. "Mommy will never leave me, will she?" The voice whimpered. Estelle fell back onto the floor, trying to kick the doll away, but when she looked up, she realized she was surrounded by the shop's objects. The antique armoires, the copper mirror, they had all formed an impenetrable barricade. Estelle realized she couldn't escape. Genevieve didn't just haunt the house. It controlled the entire space. In her last breath, Estelle saw the doll stand upright on her chest. The porcelain smile was now cracked, and a single black tear rolled down its cheek. Genevieve leaned in. "We'll play forever, Mommy." Episode 5. The Haunted Cornfield of Iowa. This is Iowa, the land of cornfields stretching to the horizon. When you see these fields during the day, they are symbols of bounty. But at night, they become towering dark walls, creating a living, inescapable maze where the wind whispers forgotten names. Our protagonist is Elias, an investigative journalist specializing in missing persons cases. He is looking into the Carver farm, where every few years, a hiker, a hunter, or even a local resident vanishes without a trace. It is rumored that the cornfield is so vast, it creates its own distinct space-time. Elias set up a small camp right at the edge of the field. He brought an infrared drone camera and an advanced GPS unit. He was convinced the disappearances were due to simple geographical confusion. As night fell, the darkness swallowed everything. The tall, thick cornstalks blocked out all light. Elias launched his drone. On the screen, the cornfield appeared as a blurry green maze, but everything seemed clear. He could see the path he planned to take. He stepped inside, carrying his backpack and a voice recorder. Immediately, he felt suffocated. The air inside the cornfield was thick and heavy with heat. He walked about 50 meters. The drone began to malfunction. The screen flickered and then went black. Technical glitch, Elias muttered, trying to reassure himself. He decided to continue deeper, following the faint path. He called out his name, the name of the farm, trying to gauge the sound's reverberation, but the cornfield swallowed his voice. After about 15 minutes, he checked his GPS device. It showed his location, but something was wrong. He should have covered at least 500 meters, but the device indicated he was only 75 meters from his camp. Maybe magnetic interference, he thought. He decided to turn right, heading straight north according to his compass, to get out. He walked for another 10 minutes. When he checked the GPS, it indicated he had returned to the exact same starting position. He was lost. Suddenly, he heard a rustling. Not the sound of wind. This rustling had a rhythm, a purpose, as if someone was walking. The sound wasn't far away. It was right in the corn row next to him. Elias stood still. His heart pounded in his chest. A low, dull sound echoed. Thud, thud, thud. He cautiously shone his flashlight through the gap between two corn rows. He saw a tall, gaunt silhouette standing there. It wasn't human. It was too tall. It wore no clothing, but its body was mottled and rough, like it was woven from dry corn stalks and husks. It had no face, just an indistinct dark patch where a head should be. The entity didn't move. It just stood there, facing him, on the other side of the row. Elias backed away, starting to run. He ran as fast as he could, but the rustling sound relentlessly pursued him, sometimes on the left, sometimes on the right, sometimes right in front of him. These husk creatures didn't need to run. They slithered through the field like fish swimming through water. He stopped in a small clearing, gasping for breath. He tried his phone, but still, no signal whatsoever. He looked around. Now he didn't just see one silhouette. He saw multiple figures, tall and still, standing at the end of every corn row. Dozens of husk entities, standing in the darkness, silent like ancient guardians. They didn't surround him to attack. They surrounded him to prevent escape. Then, Elias saw something horrific. He looked down and saw a footprint, his own footprint. He had been running in circles, but the worst part, he saw a wooden stake hammered into the ground, and on that stake there was a jacket. The jacket of a hunter who went missing 3 years ago. The jacket was tattered, but it still held the shape of a standing body. This cornfield was not a physical maze. It was a spiritual trap. The husk creatures were the souls of the victims who had been caught, torn apart, and woven into the very fabric of the field. The sound came again. This time, it was right above Elias's head. He looked up. The corn stalks directly above him were bending. Slowly, with a faint, grating, crackling sound, they curved and clustered into a canopy above him, completely cutting off the last bit of dim light. The corn stalks became giant fingers closing in, trapping him in a tight space. Elias tried to slash the stalks with his machete, but the corn stalks had become as hard as steel, their razor-sharp leaves scraping his skin. The rustling grew closer and closer. He felt himself being squeezed, and the cold, damp breath of earth and dry husks enveloped him. He screamed, but the sound was instantly swallowed by the dense corn walls. Elias was not just physically trapped. He was being absorbed into the structure of the cornfield. And then he looked at his own arm. His skin was starting to turn yellow, brittle, and his veins began to stand out, looking like twisted roots. He was being woven into one of the husk creatures, becoming the next silent, faceless guardian of the murderous field. Episode 6, The Asylum's Last Patient. This is Blackwood Asylum in Massachusetts. Closed since 1968, Blackwood was no peaceful retirement home. It was a brick-built prison where screams soaked into the plaster walls, and the long, dark corridors housed the most brutal treatments of the 20th century. This story follows a team of 3 urban explorers/researchers. Leo, the cameraman, Maya, the audio specialist, and Sam, the team leader and guide. Their sole objective in breaking into Blackwood: to find and record sound in room B12, rumored to be the cell of the final patient, whom the nurses simply called the entity. They navigated the drafty halls where old wheelchairs were scattered. Everything was covered in a thick layer of dust, yet the air still carried a strange, persistent odor: copper, old blood, and disinfectant. They found the entity's file left on the chief doctor's desk. The file stated the patient had no name, only a number. He didn't speak or move, but nurses were frequently injured near him. They noted episodes of sudden temperature drops and feelings of extreme, debilitating madness in anyone who tried to make contact. After descending a dark spiral staircase, they reached the basement, the most isolated area, reserved for the most severe cases. The cold here was twice as intense as the upper floors. They found room B12 at the end of a flooded corridor. The heavy steel door, with its tiny peephole, was secured by a long rusted lock. "Ready?" Sam asked, his voice tense. Leo used a small crowbar to break the lock. When the door swung open, they saw nothing but an old steel cot and a ripped mattress. The cell was completely empty, save for the heavily scratched gray stone walls. Maya turned on her advanced digital audio recorder. Immediately, the display showed extremely high sonic activity, far exceeding normal levels. Maya put on her headphones. Her face went pale. "Maya, what do you hear?" Sam asked. "It's not voices," she stammered. "It's the sound of desperate knocking." The violent knocking, the frantic scraping on metal and stone, echoed in her headphones with terrible intensity, as if the entity was still confined within the very structure of the room. Leo began filming the room. He panned his camera across the walls. When he checked the screen, he saw a faint, blurry phantom standing behind Sam, almost blending into the shadows. The phantom was skeletal, starved-looking. But it wasn't looking at Sam. It was looking directly at Leo through the camera lens. The phantom whispered a name, not the patient's name. It was Sam's name. "Sam, we need to go. I feel too cold," Leo said, struggling to keep his voice steady. But Sam didn't respond. He was standing in front of the B12 wall, taking off his jacket. "What are you doing?" Maya asked, alarmed. Sam turned around. His eyes were wide, wet with tears. He began repeating nonsensical words, fragmented and disjointed phrases. It was the voice of the asylum patient. "They took the spark. I need it. She needs it. Promised." Sam repeated in a high-pitched voice that wasn't his own. The entity's soul wasn't in the room. It was in the file. It was pure madness that had found a new body to continue its suffering. Then, Sam started clawing at his face, not scratching lightly. He used his fingernails to savagely rake his cheeks and eyes, as if trying to tear off his own skin. "I need the light. I need to take the light away," Sam screamed, blood streaming from his wounds. Leo and Maya tried to restrain him, but Sam had a maniacal strength. He struggled, repeating the screams and desperate knocking that Maya had heard in her headphones. As Leo wrestled Sam to the floor, he saw a horrific detail. Scattered on the cold floor were tiny porcelain shards, small white pieces with a faint blue tint. They looked exactly like the shattered fragments of the porcelain doll's eyes from New Orleans that he had read about online. The stories were connecting. The entity in this asylum was not a single spirit. It was a dark energy conduit, linking all the cursed locations they had heard about. Maya grabbed Sam, trying to drag him out of the basement area. As they pulled Sam away, He stopped struggling. He just laughed, a vacant, utterly insane laugh, and whispered, "They found a new box. It won't be cold anymore. Never." When they finally dragged Sam out of Blackwood, he was completely catatonic. He kept rambling about stolen warmth and the fields that never end. They got Sam out of the asylum, but they didn't get Sam out of Blackwood's madness. The entity's soul had found its release. It was no longer locked in cold room B12. It had transferred to a new body, a new box, to continue its existence. Episode 7: The Diver and the Cursed Wreck. This is the cold, fierce coast of Oregon, a place where the waves are not just water, but arms reaching out from the abyss. Our story takes place in the offshore waters, where a mysterious shipwreck is known as the Siren's Call. Our protagonist is Elias Vance, a professional commercial diver who puts his faith in science and reason. Elias was hired by a private collection group to salvage an iron chest believed to hold treasure from the wreck. The Siren's Call sank in the early 1900s, but the strange thing was that it hadn't disintegrated. Sonar reports indicated it was almost intact at a depth of 300 feet, about 90 meters. Elias performed his first dive in the late afternoon. As he descended, the sunlight was quickly swallowed by the ocean's gloom. At that depth, solitude was a physical entity, enveloping him. Finally, he saw it. The Siren's Call sat on the seabed sand, majestic and almost undamaged, unlike any other wreck. The ship appeared to be supernaturally preserved. Elias entered the main cabin. He turned on his headlamp. Everything was intact. The table, chairs, even copper mugs that had fallen to the floor. There was very little dust or marine life. Then, he saw the crew. They weren't skeletons or rotting corpses. They were phantom sailors at work. One was mopping the floor, another was coiling ropes. All were steeped in absolute silence. They moved slowly, repeating their daily tasks, completely unresponsive to Elias's presence. Elias, with his experience, knew these ghosts were not nitrogen hallucinations. They were physical in appearance, nearly transparent, and they radiated a terrifying coldness, even through his protective wetsuit. He passed through the galley. A ghostly cook stood before a cold stove. When Elias shone his light, the phantom slowly turned around. It had no eyes, only two dark sockets. It didn't speak. It only stared. And in that stare, Elias sensed an unbearable loneliness. Elias continued his search for the treasure chest. He found it in the captain's cabin, a heavy iron box lying beneath an old nautical chart. As he tried to attach the lifting hook, he realized the horror. He looked at the old chart and saw a red line drawn by hand, tracing outward from the shipwreck location. The line didn't stop at the coast. It ended at a single point, marked by a small cross, directly beneath his own house. The treasure wasn't gold. The treasure was a curse that connected its possessor to the eternal solitude of the crew. Just then, he heard a crackling in his headset. It was static, but then it morphed into a faint, water-distorted voice whispering, "Don't leave. You'll be lonely. It's warmer here." Elias realized that the ghostly crew didn't want to kill him. They wanted him to join them. They were trapped souls, unable to leave the vessel, and they craved the warmth and company of the living to share their endless isolation. As Elias tried to move, he felt an icy hand placed on his shoulder. He turned. It was the captain's ghost, pale face, soaking wet hair, chapped lips, but his eyes were filled with pleading. The phantom captain didn't use his hand. He used a single, thin, rotten finger to point at Elias's breathing regulator. He didn't want conversation. He wanted Elias to remove the mask. "We'll be at sea forever, in silence." The captain's voice echoed in his headset, not through radio, but through a direct, spiritual intrusion. Elias struggled. He kicked the phantom captain in the chest, but the incorporeal body passed right through. He began swimming upward, abandoning the cursed iron chest. As he cleared the main cabin, he looked back. The entire ghostly crew had gathered at the railing, standing silently, watching him ascend. There was no anger, only a profound sadness. Elias swam toward the surface as fast as he could, leaving the iron box behind. When he broke the surface and emerged onto his boat, he was nearly unconscious from decompression. The next day, he told the collection group that the box was unsalvageable. But as he was cleaning his wetsuit, he saw something wedged into the fabric. It was a single, old gold coin from the 1800s. The only coin. When Elias picked up the coin, he felt a wave of coldness radiate from his fingers. He looked at the coin's face and saw the engraving of a sailing ship. The darkness set in. Elias felt the solitude of the deep ocean engulf him again, right in the middle of his warm living room. He heard the distant sound of water lapping at the shore, and he realized that, even though he left the wreck, he could not leave the loneliness of the crew. He had carried away the true treasure of the Siren's Call. Episode 8. The Harvest Festival of the Devil. This is Haven's End, Vermont, a small town framed by vibrant red foliage and somber, brooding hills. In October, this town comes alive with its annual Harvest Festival. From the outside, it's a perfect picture of rural Americana. Carved pumpkins, candied apples, and friendly smiles. Our protagonist is Chloe, a college student seeking a quiet getaway. She rents a small room in Haven's End for the week of the festival. From the moment she arrived, she noticed the town's unsettling perfection. Everyone was too cheerful, too friendly. Their faces, though smiling, had an odd blankness, as if emotion was just a thin, worn mask. The first rule she heard from her landlady was, never leave town after sunset on festival night. The gates close. The woman explained it was just an old tradition, a joke, but her eyes held no humor. Chloe, being curious, began to investigate. She found the community history library, a small building filled with aged documents. She discovered a pastor's journal from 1789. The journal described a red covenant struck between the original settlers and a subterranean entity. The covenant demanded an annual sacrifice, an outsider's seed, in exchange for a bountiful harvest and a mild winter. The sacrifice had to be someone from outside, someone without deep roots in the community. The young woman realized with horror, the festival wasn't to celebrate the harvest. The festival was a hunt. Festival night arrived. The entire town gathered in the harvested field, where a huge bonfire was lit. People wore dark cloaks and began a grotesque circular dance, the cheerful folk music becoming distorted and tense. Chloe stood at the edge of the crowd, trying to remain inconspicuous. She saw the mayor, who had welcomed her so warmly, now holding a torch. His face no longer held a smile. It was filled with cold, single-minded focus. Suddenly, the music stopped. Every eye turned toward Chloe. An elderly woman stepped out from the crowd, pointing directly at Chloe. She spoke in a monotone voice, loud enough for the entire town to hear. The outsider seed has been chosen. The harvest is due. Honor the promise. Panic set in. Chloe turned and ran toward the main road. She fled into the woods where she believed she could hide. She ran past the trees and saw her car headlights at the end of the road. Freedom. But as she reached the car, the heavy iron gate at the town's only exit slammed shut, secured by a massive chain. She was trapped. Chloe turned back toward the woods. She didn't hear footsteps, but she heard muttering. Hundreds of low voices whispering, echoing through the forest. The townspeople weren't chasing her. They were forming a living barrier. She saw them. They weren't running. They were walking slowly, keeping an even distance, forming an increasingly tight circle around her. They carried torches and scythes, their faces now reflecting the eerie red glow of the bonfire. She ran back to the car and tried to unlock it, but when she looked into the window, she saw her own reflection had changed. Her image in the car glass wore a torn white shroud, and her eyes were filled with hollow despair. She had been assigned her role, the sacrifice. She realized the festival wasn't just a ritual. It was a spiritual transformation. Each year, an outsider was absorbed to enrich the town, and their soul became trapped, becoming part of the collective blankness. As the townspeople closed in, Chloe saw one final horror. She saw them holding their jack-o'-lanterns high. The lanterns hadn't been carved with knives. The twisted, hollow faces on the pumpkins looked exactly like her own face, stretched and distorted. That was how they prepared for her. In her final moments, a man placed a hand on her shoulder. His empty eyes met hers, and he whispered, "Don't be afraid, Seed. The harvest will be plentiful, and the silence will be ours." Chloe's scream was muffled by the festival music, now louder than ever, accompanied by the joyous, savage cheering of the townspeople. Episode 9, The Shifting Forest. This is the Olympic National Forest in Washington, a place where spruce trees pierce the sky and the thick moss cover swallows all sound. But this forest holds a darker secret. Some say it is a living entity, capable of altering its very structure to disorient the mind and time of those who wander into it. Our protagonist is Daniel, a veteran park ranger with over 20 years of experience. He knows every trail, every stream in this region. Recently, he's noticed inexplicable things. Solidly nailed trail markers are suddenly switched around, and abandoned campsites inexplicably reappear where they had been cleared out. One morning, Daniel was on patrol. He came to an area he was sure he had cleared last year. There, he saw a bizarre spruce tree. Its trunk was not straight. It spiraled perfectly from base to top, like a twisted spine. He had never seen this tree before. Daniel approached and placed his hand on the bark. Immediately, he felt a profound coldness shoot up his arm, and a sickly sweet fetid smell of mold and damp moss assaulted his senses. He looked at his compass. The needle spun wildly, unable to find north. "Magnetic anomaly," he muttered, trying to maintain his rationality. He decided to turn back to the main trail. But after walking for about 20 minutes, he found himself standing in front of the spiraling spruce tree again. This time, there was a new object at the base of the tree. An old, tattered backpack, filled with journals about America's cursed locations. When he opened the backpack, he found a note. "You must stay calm. This forest feeds on panic. It feeds on time." Daniel panicked. He threw the backpack away and started running in a random direction. He ran for a distance, then stopped. He saw a faint figure strolling between two large trees. It was a young woman, dressed in clothing from the 1980s. She was looking for something. Daniel recognized her. She was Sarah, a hiker who had vanished in 1983. "Sarah!" he called out. The girl turned. Her face was blank, but not from malice. It was blank with confusion and forgetfulness. She didn't look at Daniel. She looked right through him. She mumbled, "How long have I been walking? I'm so hungry." Daniel tried to approach her, but she dissolved into the mist. Then he saw another figure. This one was closer, clearer. It was a man in a park ranger uniform, walking slowly with a bewildered expression. It was Daniel. Daniel from 10 years ago. The younger man was looking at his hand, confused by his spinning compass. His face was younger, but his eyes already held a hint of the fear the current Daniel knew. The current Daniel hid behind a tree, watching his past self walk by. The forest wasn't just a spatial maze, it was a temporal trap. It captured lost souls, turning them into phantoms who repeated their final moments. Suddenly, Daniel felt a heavy pressure on his chest. He looked down. The thick, spongy layer of moss on the ground began to come alive. Thin, black roots slowly crept up his boots. The forest was trying to anchor him. He ran through a sparse area, and he saw a clear sign of the outside world, a forest boundary marker post. He ran to it and tried to leap over the marker, but the moment he touched it, the post shivered and dissolved before his eyes, reforming into another spiraling spruce tree. Daniel desperately looked around. Everything had cycled back. He was standing in front of the original spiraling spruce tree again, but this time, there was a new object at the base of the tree. Not the backpack. It was the axe Daniel had lost 2 weeks ago. Its blade was shiny, completely unrusted. He looked down at his hands. They started to tremble. He saw the wrinkles and age spots on his skin suddenly become deeper, darker. The forest was absorbing his time and youth. He turned back and saw the other phantoms. Sarah, the missing hunters, and his past self, Daniel from 10 years ago. They were all standing in a loose circle, watching him. The current Daniel was no longer young. He was aging rapidly. He screamed. It wasn't a vocal scream, but the dry, rasping gasp of extreme old age. And then he heard the voice of the forest, a low, deep whisper echoing from the mossy ground. "Rest. You have walked too long. Become part of the quiet." He tried to move, but his muscles were paralyzed. He collapsed onto the cold moss, feeling the black roots tightening around his legs. As he closed his eyes, the last thing he saw was the face of his past self walking slowly toward him. Not to save him, but to witness his final disappearance. Episode 10. The Final Loop. All the stories lead here. The cold basement of Blackwood Asylum, the shifting Olympic forest, the endless headlights of Route 66. Every horror was a broadcast from a single entity, the Shadow Weaver. Our protagonist is Professor Alastair Finch, not a victim, but a researcher of the supernatural and a psychologist. Alastair has watched, studied, and cataloged all 9 horror stories told in this series. He noticed a binding thread. All victims experienced isolation, absorption, and repetition within an eternal loop. He believed the cursed locations were merely energetic anchor points, and the true center of the malice was a quiet, forgotten place, one that belonged to no story. The derelict colonial movie theater in a small, dreary town in Pennsylvania. Alastair broke into the theater at midnight. The air smelled of dust, stale popcorn, and old film chemicals. He navigated the ripped velvet seats and found the dark, damp projection room upstairs. In the room, there was no modern equipment, only a vintage 1940s film projector, still loaded with a thick, old reel of acetate film. Alistair mounted the film reel onto the projector and turned it on. The blank screen below came to life. The first shot was a static image. The house by the mirror lake, from episode 1. The reel began to play. It wasn't showing a movie. It was showing raw footage of the final moments of all our victims. Clara and Liam standing in the lake house. Clara's face fading before the entity's absorption. Chloe in episode 8, being surrounded by the townspeople, their smiles etched on the pumpkin lanterns. Elias in episode 7, struggling underwater, with the mournful face of the phantom captain pressing close. Sam in episode 6, violently clawing at his own face in room B12. Every scene was brief but contained the most intense agony. Alistair backed away, horrified. He was right. This place was the archive of the horror, the source of broadcast for the ghost stories. Suddenly, the film reel changed. The footage became shaky, as if shot with a handheld camera. Alistair saw a man in an overcoat sitting in a dark projection room. The man was intently staring at a screen, scribbling something into a notebook. The man was Alistair Finch himself. Alistair was watching himself on the screen. The film reel was showing the present. On the screen, the image of Alistair looked up, his eyes wide. He saw his on-screen face contorted in pure terror. And then, the Alistair on the screen began to speak. The voice was amplified, booming through the theater. Not his own, but a deep, dark, almost inhuman voice. You have watched all 10 stories. You have heard them all. And now, you have come to the source of the broadcast. The loop must be completed. Alistair turned around. The chair he was sitting in while watching the film suddenly glowed. A blinding white light that sucked the air and sound out of the room. He looked up at the projector. The final reel, the one currently playing, was turning on its own. On the reel's label, instead of a title, a name was written in fresh red ink. Alistair Finch, the New Teller. Alistair realized this malevolent entity wasn't a ghost or a demon. It was the obsession with storytelling and the greed of the listener. It needed new victims to create new stories, and it needed a new conduit to transmit those stories. He wasn't the investigator. He was the candidate for the Shadow Weaver. Alistair tried to run, but the projection room had warped into a prison. The doors had vanished. He looked back at the screen. The film was playing the scene of the current Alistair standing in the middle of the room, desperate. Then, the film froze on a single frame. The frame of Alistair, his face frozen in terror. Then the projector made a clack sound, automatically unthreading the film reel. The blinding white light from the chair instantly went out. Alistair was gone. The chair was empty. The vintage projector, now without a reel, began to turn slowly on its own, as if awaiting new material. And on the desk where Alistair had placed his notebook, a fountain pen automatically began to write. It wrote, in Alistair's identical handwriting, a chilling new title.